On Saturday, March 16th, 2024, Steph Curry and the Golden State Warriors were in Los Angeles to face off against LeBron James and the LA Lakers. The Warriors would topple the Lakers 128-121, but the biggest story that night wasn't either of the all-time greats. It was the timekeepers. One of the most bizarre nights in the league's recent memory. The final 2 minutes of the game clock took 23 minutes and 27 seconds of real time to complete after countless score clock malfunctions. These malfunctions followed a strange sequence where the refs reviewed an out-of-bounds call and in the process decided to go back further and review a LeBron James 3, which was ultimately disallowed. Which some people have theories on why that would be. There was also another sequence in the fourth quarter where the Warriors were gifted an extra shot clock late in the game because of the same suspected malfunction. In what felt like a surreal AAU tournament, the final 2 minutes of the game were completed by having the in-game announcer call out the increments of 5-second intervals. NBA media and fans alike were rightfully in awe of something like this happening at the professional level. But this isn't the NBA's first instance of timekeeping trickery. In fact, it is far from the biggest scandal to come from the NBA score clock. Today, the league seems to have almost a symbiotic relationship with sports gambling. Betting lines from DraftKings and FanDuel are discussed on live television alongside actual basketball analysis and posted from official NBA accounts. But in 1985, working in basketball and being involved with sports betting was a non-starter. Actually working for the league and doing so was seen as villainous. So what happens when a team's scorekeeping staff find a way to beat the odds makers in Vegas to a point where NBA records are broken and betting on that team was completely disallowed? Well, somebody's got to pay. It's time to learn the story of the Detroit Pistons timekeepers and the NBA's secret point-shaving scandal. What if I told you one of the most prolific NBA scorers in the 80s wasn't Alex English or Moses Malone? In fact, NBA leaderboards don't record any of the stats this individual contributed. Would you believe me if I told you it might have been this towel boy and future Pistons scorekeeper and team psychologist, Melvin Hoberman? To get to the bottom of this claim, we need to rewind back to 1954. This was before the Pistons had even been established in Detroit, when they resided in their former home of Fort Wayne, Indiana. The Pistons selected Jack Molina's third overall in the '53 NBA draft. Jack would earn himself an All-Star selection during his rookie season, but was unable to attend the game for a fairly surprising reason. He was found guilty of betting on both his own team and other teams, and was banned from the NBA after only 32 games. The Brooklyn native allegedly had mob ties with Thomas Eberle, the eventual acting boss of the Genovese crime family who would be fatally shot in '72 in a suspected mob hit. After Molinas was expelled from the league, he would later find himself a key figure in the 1961 point-shaving scandal that consumed college basketball. This same scandal involved eventual Basketball Hall of Famers Connie Hawkins and Roger Brown, who were blackballed from the NCAA and the NBA as a consequence. Molinas was handed down a 10 to 15 year sentence in '63 for his role in the scheme, already infamous from 1954 and his own college scandal in '51. He was also the inspiration for the lead character in The Longest Yard, and he deserves a deep dive of his own, from his time in the NBA to Attica. The Pistons would leave Fort Wayne in '57 and relocate to Detroit, where the franchise still stands nearly 70 years later. Perhaps the Pistons were doomed to repeat history sooner than they thought. When the team moved to Detroit, a Dearborn, Michigan local, Melvin Hoberman, would secure a job with the organization as a towel boy in the early 1970s. Before we get to him, let's rewind back to the year 1970. The Pistons had endured 13 losing seasons after relocating to Detroit, and the city was pining for a competitive team. Throughout this era, Detroit was arguably a Tiger City. The franchise collected their third and fourth World Series during these years, while the Pistons sharpened their reputation as a hard-nosed, blue-collar franchise. One of the more interesting things of note from this period was the Pistons' decision to name their third-year player, Dave DeBusschere, as the player-coach at 24 years old, making him still to this day the youngest person to ever hold the job. Here is a young DeBusschere giving some basketball tips to a few locals, including a Michigan University student, Andrea Hoberman, the sister of none other than her central figure, Mel Hoberman. Small world. By this time, DeBusschere had already went through a brief stint with the Chicago White Sox as an amateur free agent, lasting 2 seasons in the majors before retiring to focus on basketball. Not before managing to pitch a shutout against the Cleveland Indians on August 13th, 1963. Gimmicks like hiring DeBusschere, who flamed out as a coach but would go on to be a Hall of Famer in New York, weren't enough to turn around the franchise, and the Pistons were sold to businessman Bill Davidson in 1974 for $6 million. Despite the sale of the franchise, old demons from the past would resurface when former Piston Jack Molinas made the news once again on August 13th, 1975. As Detroit geared up for the 75-76 season, Molinas was shot in the back of the head at the age of 43 while relaxing in his extravagant Hollywood Hills mansion, believed to be brought upon his connections to the world of organized crime and adult entertainment. Around this time, a 32-year-old graduate from MSU and working psychologist, Mel Hoberman, took a job with the team as a towel boy in the mid-70s. He managed to work himself up to a spot on the scorekeeping crew in 1977 and began his first season behind the table at the age of 34. The league in 77 was 1 year removed from the ABA merger and undergoing what can only be described as a facelift. It wasn't immune to allegations of tampering and illicit drug use. People always talk about the tape delay years, but not what about was actually happening on the tapes. For example, how about this rowdy fan assaulting referee Richie Powers during Game 5 of the 76 Suns-Celtics series? This is during the NBA Finals, mind you. This game is widely referred to as the best NBA Finals game in history, needing 3 straight overtimes to decide the winner, and it's worth a story on its own. Or what about Maurice Lucas and Darryl Dawkins squaring off in a fistfight during Game 2 of the 77 NBA Finals, drawing fans and police alike into the fray? Beyond just optics, there also seemed to be a notable bias towards the home team. In 76, the home team winning percentage was a staggering 76.8% compared to 67% in 75. For a comparison of other sports at the time, the NFL had a percentage of 56.8 and the NHL was 51.2. Oddsmakers in Vegas had noticed the changing tides, and the point spreads changed accordingly. The NBA's director of security, Jack Joyce, claimed that it wasn't unusual to see 11.5 to 12 point spreads, compared to the usual averages of 3.5 to 7.5. Joyce was a former FBI agent, named director of the NBA security in 72. He was responsible for maintaining the sanctity of the league, but during his time saw some of the most rampant drug and gambling allegations in NBA history. Here he is present at another NBA conspiracy, the 85 frozen envelope debacle. Something was running up the score at home in the NBA, but the public had no idea what. People seemed to just attribute it to old-fashioned home field advantage. In 77, an article in the Toronto Star claimed that Toronto bookies were no longer accepting bets on the NBA. The reason? A recent game between the New York Knicks and the Portland Trail Blazers on March 10, 1997, that ended bizarrely. The Knicks were a 6-point favorite. With 2 seconds left in the game, they led 108-102, leaving the bet to be a push, refunding the money for both sides of the bet. The ball was inbounded to Hall of Famer Earl the Pearl Monroe, who casually turned towards his own basket with 2 defenders attached to him and put up what looked like a carefully placed shot on his own team's net, cutting the score to 108-104. And just like that, the underbet had won at the last second. The 11-year veteran Monroe played it off by saying that he thought the game was over, that he forgot what end of the court he was standing in. Even the Knicks coach at the time, Red Holtzman, was quoted as saying, "It looked like it was a shot, but I wasn't watching that carefully." The NBA and Director of Security Joyce conducted a brief investigation into the matter, where Monroe's claims shifted to now say that he had carelessly thrown the ball into the air. Joyce claimed that Monroe's explanation was sufficient, and it was done in the spur of the moment, despite the shot being described as purposeful by the newspapers at the time. As we earlier established, the NBA had a notable home court advantage in the 70s and 80s. Looking back at the NBA scoring leaders from 76 to 81, it seems like players are getting a little hometown love, but the biggest takeaway is just how dominant George Gervin was. Once you get past that fact, you might also notice that the Jazz and Spurs are the only teams listed. Pistol Pete was with the Jazz for 6 seasons and benefited an average of 3.5 points a game at home. Is this an anomaly or a sign of something more? Gervin spent an incredible 14 seasons with the Spurs across the ABA and NBA, but he only saw a benefit of .24 points per game at home while in the NBA. Another dead end. Anecdotally, Alex English is said to have put up some of the emptiest stats throughout the 80s. When he moved from the Pacers to the Nuggets in '79, his points per game rocketed from 14.9 to 21.3, no doubt benefiting from his minutes per game reaching new career averages. But what if something else was moving the needle for the Nuggets, the same team who broke the NBA single-game scoring record in December 1983? English benefited an average of 1.5 points per game during his time with the Nuggets, including 3.8 during the 82-83 season, where he grabbed a scoring title. Here is a comparison to some of the league stars from that year, from lowest to highest. Essentially, using the top 20 scorers each year as a baseline, you can start to measure up the average benefit from playing at home. Using these totals, we can begin to create an approximate metric for the benefit received from playing at home. Let's go with HBI to make it snappy. In 82-83, it averaged out to 0.290. By this measure, you can assume that anyone above this point benefited from playing at home more than the average player. In fact, English and his Nuggets teammate Dan Issel drastically stand out from their contemporaries, with only Bernard King and Darrell Griffith coming even close. And would you look at that? Knicks, Nuggets, and Jazz. Seems to be a trend here. So maybe a few players here and there benefited from home officiating, the altitude of their home arena, or the confidence instilled from fans. But what about the other end of the spectrum? Players who are drastically affected negatively at home. While Thomas scored less at home during his career by a small margin, his assist totals were a different story. He averaged an extra assist per game while at home, and Detroit's timekeeping staff have been rumored in the papers as juking the stats. Although not all of the games are archived from this time, I decided to review the available ones from 81 to 85. Call it a hunch. In this game late in his rookie season, box scores gave him 10 assists. Watching the game footage and counting myself, there were only 7 clear assists and a failed and one. It has been claimed that handing out assists on failed and ones was one of the scorekeeping tricks used to pile up assists. So giving the rookie point guard a few extra during the second last game of the season probably went unnoticed. And who was working the scoring crew during that time? None other than Mel Hoberman, former Pistons ball boy. This is where our story begins to unravel. During the 81-82 season, and approximately 3 years after joining the scoring crew, Hoberman was a practicing psychologist in the greater Detroit area with an active patient load.
Detroit picks 6'1", 180-pound Isiah Thomas.
During the same year, the Pistons drafted their franchise-altering point guard, Isiah Thomas. Hoberman was responsible for running the game clock at home. Hoberman's first wrongdoing was actually not with the Pistons, but with a 17-year-old patient. The following graphic account can be found fully linked below, but I'll briefly summarize the events. While treating a 17-year-old who had recently attempted suicide, Hoberman made countless sexual advances and was insistent on hypnotizing her, to which she denied. Throughout their time together, he would consistently physically assault her, and even implicitly offer to pay for sex. Like many people in her position, she was intimidated by Hoberman because he was in a position of authority, and only came forward decades later to state officials, who in turn said too much time had passed and nothing could be done. Although this happened in 1981, it only came to light in 2019 after the former patient made a Facebook post describing her story. Speaking of integrity, the NBA in '81 continued to boil over with allegations of fixing, gambling, and crooked stats. In fact, most professional leagues began to employ the use of former FBI agents as security officers in each city that hosted a team. Ironically, these security officers would usually work closely with bookmakers, as they were the first to detect any betting anomalies in their market. This was especially heightened after the world was rocked by the recent Boston College scandal that unraveled in 1980, when the real Henry Hill from Goodfellas bribed several Boston College basketball players to shave points. If the mob had targeted a property as visible as college basketball, what would stop them from trying their hand at the NBA, a considerably less popular entity at the time? According to Forbes, the 1981 finals rank among the lowest rated of all time, with a household rating of 6.7%, or the percentage of TV households that watch the program. The NCAA championship mammoths this in comparison, with a household rating of 20.7 that same year. This also happened to be the same era that the NBA finals were on tape delay for half of the country, so the plausibility of a few regular season games being worked by the mafia doesn't seem outrageous. In fact, some teams at the time were not actively airing games on their home network, and instead just left the broadcast to the host team. Where this raised issues is in the case that the away team wanted to protest. They were limited to what the viewer saw on TV. One such case is when the Kansas City Kings wanted to protest a missing minute in a game against the Knicks during December 1978. The president of the Kings at the time, Joe Axelson, claimed that many people saw the clock jump 1 minute, and that the play-by-play sheet not having one foul, free throw, turnover, substitution, or made basket from 11:46 to 10:18 is almost impossible in the shot clock era. When league officials reviewed the Knicks' home footage, it was determined that only 28 seconds had elapsed between 11:46 and 10:18. This was only verified by the play-by-play sheet entries, since it was not common practice for broadcasts to have the game clock displayed. It stands to reason that any underbettors that night were thrilled to lose a whole minute. By an incredible coincidence, Earl the Pearl Monroe was on the Knicks bench, just a year removed from his own basket fiasco. Monroe averaged 12.3 points per game that year, yet only averaged 5.3 points per game in the season series against the Kings. This is not necessarily concrete proof of a fix, but the coincidences do continue to pile up around certain franchises. The Knicks scorekeeper at the time was the legend Nat Feets Browdy, a 32-year-old veteran who had been around long enough to work the first NBA season with a shot clock in 54-55. He was also known to favor teams over the other, and one story from his New York Times obituary seems to stamp this reputation. It was claimed that in a Big East Conference game, Georgetown was down by a single point with 1 second remaining when their head coach came screaming at Browdy that there should be more time, to which he responded, "I'm sorry." The clock got excited, and tacked on a few seconds onto the clock. Or the other time, he was accused in 1971 of stopping the clock in crunch time to allow the Willis Reed Knicks to erase the late-game deficit. Just a few coincidences. Here's an unrelated photo of Browdy watching a Knicks game with his Princeton buddy and Knick legend Bill Bradley, who has Willis Reed on his right. Small world. The NBA was in a precarious place in 1983, as mentioned in my previous White Heat series. The league's image was at an all-time low, and whispers of drug use and gambling were frequent. Before the Pistons were known by the public as the Bad Boys, they had a far more nefarious reputation in private circles. An article from '84 divulged the fact that during the '83-'84 season, the Detroit Pistons were a sportsbook nightmare. Gary Austin, who ran a sportsbook during the time, claimed that a group of bettors would wager on Detroit every game, home and away, walking away with a win rate of close to 90%. When it came to home games, it was even higher. This didn't appear to be a one-off problem, and Vic Salerno, a legendary Vegas oddsmaker, claimed he had a client hit 18 out of 19 Detroit games that season. With that being said, all of '83-'84 is fair game to review. As I sought out more connections between scoring and timekeeping irregularities, I couldn't help become fixated on the Pistons-Nuggets game in '83, the record breaker. This also happened to be the last NBA game played with replacement refs, as the referees' union had failed to come to a decision with the league that summer and were forced into a late-season agreement. In order to actually verify the running time versus game clock, I would have to do exactly what the league office did in the '80s, but without the help of the score sheet. By calculating all of the live play on the broadcast and comparing it to the available glances of the game clock in the arena, the real duration of the game comes out. For example, with 8:27 left in the first, the game had already been running for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Just like that, the game is stretched by 14 seconds, or approximately one possession. The final play-by-play sheet was 16 pages long, a nightmare for any league official trying to verify any individual stats or baskets. After calculating the real running time of the game, here is what we found out. By the end of the second quarter, 48 seconds was added on. By the end of regulation, a minute 23. After 3 overtimes, this ballooned to 2:26. During the league's investigation on timekeeping accuracy, they found that some games were running an extra 5 to 6 minutes long. In comparison, this game only running an extra 2.5 minutes while having 3 overtimes might be below average for the era. That being said, with NBA teams scoring a combined average of 4.5 points a minute, 2.5 minutes of scoring is enough to disrupt almost any bet. This probably wasn't helped by the fact that the replacement refs weren't up to NBA standard, handing out 87 fouls on the night and 117 free throws. If it's possible to have a legendary NBA ref, Earl Strom is that person. Over his 32-year career, he bristled a lot of hairs, but was also consistently rated as one of the top-performing refs in the league. You may also remember him from the White Heat series, where we covered him getting into a fistfight with Suns GM, Jerry Colangelo.
Grabbed his water and he's looking right at me and he says, "I can take you."
Strom went on record as saying that he reffed 9 games during December 1984 that were under 2 hours, and a game from December 22nd, '84 stands out dramatically, as running only an hour 43, with both teams scoring 22.4 points below their combined scoring averages on the year. The average length of an NBA game at this time was claimed to be 2 hours and 7.7 minutes, which included dead balls and clock stoppages. But between the '83 shelling in Denver and the missing minutes in '79 and '84, it seemed like the length of a basketball game wasn't set in stone. Outside speculation reached a fever pitch in fall of '84, when reports from Vegas sportbooks had claimed the Detroit Pistons were pulled from all betting boards. Miraculously, they were reinstated following this game on December 4th, 1984. This also happened to be the last game Mel Hoberman worked on the clock, before being removed by the league. This December 4th home game, where Detroit hosted Boston, ran 2 hours and 7 minutes, according to Basketball Reference, a perfectly average length for the time. When counting the actual game clock, things seem a little different. After calculating the real running time of this game, it appeared to be 51 seconds fast by the third quarter. And unfortunately, the only tape of the game I could find begins to degrade around this point, and we're unable to confirm the final total. By the pace set in the first 3 quarters, it would be fair to assume the final running time was missing over a minute. In what seems like no coincidence, Hoberman was replaced by the league the next day. When Hoberman was questioned by the papers, he denied any wrongdoing and claimed that the league had moved 5 to 6 guys already in other cities. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't confirm where that might have been, but the cynic in me likes to think it might involve some familiar locales. Less than a week after Hoberman's dismissal, the Pistons were added back to betting boards. Sid Diamond, a sportsbook director from Vegas, had claimed that he first caught the irregularity last season when he noticed that specific teams were winning almost all of their bets, whether it was under or over. Multiple bookies claimed that bettors were winning on 85 to 90% of Pistons bets, and even higher on the home games. The article highlighted the power of the timekeeper to subtract or add a significant amount of time, with teams averaging 4.5 points a minute. It was an odds maker's nightmare. The sane decision would be to expel Hoberman and keep him as far as you can away from the league, right? In an incredible turn, he was moved off the clock and allowed to stay on the scorekeeping team, years later being promoted to a much more prominent position within the Pistons organization. The Bad Boys Pistons were marred by stories of dysfunction, violence, adultery, and drug use. All we can hope is that the organization had a stable support system and the proper resources for help. It's a good thing that the team psychologist was, oh no. If you watched my video on the Phoenix Suns scandal, you may be familiar with William Bedford and James Edwards. Bedford and Edwards found themselves entangled in the middle of a drug and gambling indictment in Phoenix and were separately shipped out of town in '87, coincidentally, both to Detroit. Bedford already had multiple stints in rehab, but the trade to Detroit would push him over the edge. Bedford would check himself into rehab for cocaine at the end of the '87-'88 season, avoiding a lifetime ban, but also missing the '88 finals against the Lakers. During the beginning of the '88-'89 season, Bedford was 4 days away from rejoining the Pistons before he encountered another setback. Part of his stipulation to return was to call his drug counselor 30 days in a row. On the 27th day, Bedford went silent. Bedford would return to rehab in January '89 and spend the rest of the year away from the team. Bedford would watch from rehab as Detroit celebrated their first championship in franchise history, while he celebrated almost 315 days spent in treatment at the Van Nuys Chemical Dependence Facility. The ASAP facility in Van Nuys treated 14 NBA players during 1989, who stayed fit throughout their stay by playing games of horse and one-on-one with other patients. It was even funded by the league itself. It's surreal to imagine William Bedford and Mitchell Wiggins facing off, while names like Roy Tarpley and Chris Washburn waited for next up. Clippers guard Quinton Daly claimed after a 75-day stay he was in the best condition of his life when he came out. After an eventual transfer to Holly Gardens Rehab Center in North Michigan around July 1989, Bedford drew closer to a potential return with the Pistons. He was also sharing a room with Detroit Red Wing Bob Probert, another athlete who struggled with cocaine dependency and deserves a story of his own someday. After a 1.5-year hiatus, Bedford finally rejoined the team, changing his number to 00, referencing the 2 strikes he was already facing from the league. Stories began to crop up in late October of '89 that Bedford was out late on the town, and Pistons management became understandably concerned. Now, it is unknown whether he was brought in by the organization or offered his services on his own behalf. By November 1989, it was reported that Mel Hoberman had become the Pistons psychologist and was to guide Bedford's recovery and sobriety. The Pistons even saw it fit for Hoberman to speak to the media on Williams' behalf and to travel with him on road trips, sharing hotel accommodations to prevent any slip-ups. Hoberman would engage in daily sessions with Bedford, who was given Ritalin and diagnosed with a chemical imbalance. Bedford would stay stitched together long enough to help the Pistons as a third-string center, although only playing 42 games that season. That's if you qualify, sleeping in through his 1-year sobriety celebration from the Pistons as stitched together. The Pistons would go on to win their second franchise championship in a row, with Bedford playing sparse playoff minutes across 5 games. Rodman, however, would directly call out Bedford during his parade speech, claiming that he loved him like a brother. It's no doubt that Hoberman's access to Bedford gave him the chance to work with other Pistons. It seemed like Bedford's spot on the team began to waver, especially after Isiah Thomas hosted a charity game and put all of the Pistons on one team, and Bedford on the other team. Thomas went even so far to say, anything to do with William Bedford is a waste of time. Hey, not everybody deserves to wear Pistons across his chest. I guess Hoberman's treatment didn't work as well as we thought. It's also possible that Isiah was just frazzled with that summer's latest scandal, when news reports cropped up in July 1990 of Isiah Thomas being the focus of an FBI investigation for gambling, with rumors alleging that Thomas was laundering money and shaving points off for the mob. Thomas would deny the story altogether, although it was indeed confirmed that he testified before a grand jury on the matter. It was a matter of fact that Thomas cashed multiple checks over $100,000 at a grocery store owned by a friend, Emmett Denna, a move suspected to be done for the purpose of avoiding financial watchdogs. Denha would eventually be found guilty of laundering $6 million in gambling money from the Detroit Mafia sport betting rackets. Furthermore, Denha was linked to Henry Allen Hilf by way of an FBI wiretap. Hilf was Michigan's largest bookmaker at the time and the subject of multiple FBI raids. Hilf was essentially the right-hand man to Jack Vito Giacalone, a powerful figure in the Detroit crime family. Denha also happened to be the godfather of Isiah's son, and a close friend of James Edwards. Thomas's name was linked to the investigation after Pistons teammate Mark Aguirre met with a former FBI agent, Ned Timmons, expressing concern for his friend's association with gamblers. Timmons made a career out of going undercover in criminal organizations based out of Detroit, so he knew all the key players involved. This also happened to be the same week that the Pistons were playing the Bulls in the NBA's Eastern Conference Finals. I managed to track down Ned, now the president of a legal consultancy firm outside of Detroit. Incredibly, he agreed to an interview. After nearly 9 months of researching and writing the story, there was finally a breakthrough. When asked point blank about the validity of the report, he had this to say.
Well, you're refreshing my memory, but yeah, Aguirre came to me because he was a friend of a friend, and he was worried about the gambling.
When I asked what those expressed concerns were, Timmons said this.
The amount of the money and the people involved.
When I followed up on the who of the story, Ned told me this.
I know Emmett was involved. I don't recall any other names.
Ned also described the whispers around Isiah's point shaving and what he had heard.
I knew another high-stakes bookie, probably one of the biggest in Detroit, and he had said that, I don't remember what team, it was some team out in the Northwest, that it was obvious that Isiah threw the game. Or he didn't lose the game, but he shaved the points. He was missing baskets that were a slam dunk for him.
Lastly, Ned closed the interview by sharing an unbelievable run-in with Isiah Thomas and Joe Dumars.
After this came out, you know that radio guy, I don't know, put some stuff on the air or whatever and threw my name around. And so I used to work out at Big Tanny's, which was a big gym here. One day I went into Big Tanny's and I was going upstairs where the track was, and here's Isiah and Joe Dumars walking down the steps. Isiah goes, "You mother," I was going, this and that. Picked up a chair and threw it at me, and I ducked, of course. Then Dumars grabbed him, and I had done a bunch of stuff for Dumars, touchy stuff.
He would not elaborate on what touchy stuff meant, but anyways.
Dumars stopped him. Isiah wanted to fight. He was holding me to blame for this thing getting out, and
Thomas and teammate James Edwards had constant rumors swirl of their involvement in gambling. You may recall it was all but confirmed that Edwards had relationships with the world of gambling and organized crime during his '87 indictment, covered in my White Heat video. This video also covered the relationship Edwards had with Bedford, and as a veteran teammate, he was the first person to give William cocaine. A story would break in 1997 that alleged Thomas and Edwards conspired to shave points in order to win against the betting favorite, namely on December 16th versus Golden State and December 29th versus the Bucks. Maybe Thomas and Bedford had more in common than we thought. These particular games were flagged after an anonymous former Piston told investigative journalist Armin Keteyian that him and Thomas discussed the possibility of point shaving across 2 games in late 1989. Thomas was dealing with an undisclosed injury from a previous game against the Jazz, and odds makers did not know he would sit out, leaving Detroit as the betting favorite. Moments before tip-off, the lineups reveal Thomas is out with a concussion. Edwards would score only 4 points and go 1 for 5 from the line, a paltry low for someone averaging 14.5 points that season. Detroit would inevitably lose 104-92, despite being favored by 3 to win. The second instance was a home game against the Bucks on December 29, 1989, with the Pistons favored by 10. Thomas only scored 2 points in 34 minutes, his lowest on the season and 3rd lowest of his career. The Pistons would lose 99-85. The games mentioned here would seem to line up with the July 1990 FBI investigation and the timeline from Timmons, but just as it was then, nothing further ever materialized after the release of Money Players, a 1997 expose covering the subject, and the matter was dropped. The Bad Boys dynasty would effectively fizzle out after the summer of 1990, with the nail in the coffin being an Eastern Conference final sweep by the Bulls the following playoffs, where the Pistons famously walked off without shaking hands. Bedford's career with the Pistons would flame out with little controversy, outside of an arrest in late 1991 for driving on a double suspended license. After serving his jail time during the NBA All-Star break, he would never play in a Pistons jersey again, would only play 16 more games in the league as a Spur the next season. It seems like during this regime turnover, Mel Hoberman, still on the scorekeeping staff and counseling willing players, was able to latch onto another patient on the Pistons, an even more lucrative one. Hoberman's official role within the organization was still hazy, but throughout March 1992, he had gone closer with Rodman, likely through Bedford, and seemed to be in his ear and actively treating him. When Rodman broke headlines in the 92 preseason for arriving late to a game in a limousine just to watch, Hoberman rode along and sat courtside with him. Rodman was sitting out at the time dealing with a difficult divorce, and Hoberman was seemingly providing treatment. To the public, Rodman was just being over the top. Behind the scenes, it seems like the Pistons organization knew the real story. It is not known where Hoberman was during February 1993, Rodman's lowest hour, now made famous by Rodman's own retelling. Rodman on the 2nd floor of the landing strip, holding a shotgun and contemplating life. NBA reporter Craig Sager tracks him down and talks him out of it.
Disturbing incident involving Dennis Rodman. After a call from a concerned friend, police and team officials were...
The media exploded with headlines, but failed to capture the most salacious detail. Rodman's wife at the time, Anika Rodman, cheated on Dennis with a teammate, as she would recount in her own book. Bad Boys indeed.
He's known as the microwave. Vinnie Johnson.
People suspect this is why the Pistons left Vinnie Johnson, hometown favorite, unsigned after the 91 offseason, and why the troubled William Bedford remained on the roster, to appease Rodman. Hoberman was never mentioned in association with the Pistons after 1993, but it would be far from his last headline. Up until this point, it seemed Mel had touched on incredible pieces of basketball history. The ball boy of the early Pistons, a franchise stained by gambling controversy. The timekeeper during the dark years of Detroit, where Paul McKeskey was the big name, and the eventual drafting of franchise savior Isiah Thomas. After this, he was the central figure in a timekeeping scandal that seemed to ruffle feathers in Vegas, the league office, and any mafia-ran sportsbook. He was the personal therapist to William Bedford, the face of the Phoenix Suns scandal, and Dennis Rodman, one of basketball's most notorious stars. He was the team therapist to basketball's most ruthless and dysfunctional teams, the Bad Boys. Yet after 1993, Hoberman would fade into basketball obscurity, becoming just another part of society. This was until 25 years later, when Dr. Mel Hoberman, now 75 years old, was the victim of what was thought to be an armed robbery at first, but turned out to be a targeted and direct attack. Couple Jasmine Moore and Emmanuel Vaughn were eventually named, both facing numerous charges, including intent to murder. It turns out they were both former patients of Hoberman. Over the course of February 2014 to October 2018, Hoberman crossed countless professional boundaries with Moore that included trying to convince her to break up with her boyfriend, Emmanuel Vaughn, another patient of his, and to date him instead, giving Moore large sums of money and gifts in hopes of forming a relationship, and finally, sexual assault, which ultimately led to Moore telling her boyfriend about Hoberman's behavior. Emmanuel Vaughn would retaliate by stabbing Mel Hoberman 16 times after him and Moore tracked him down outside his clinic late at night. Hoberman would survive, and the couple would receive minor convictions for felonious assault and accessory after the fact. The media coverage failed to mention that they were a couple, or that Hoberman treated them both at the same time. They left out his sexual advances and apparent reports of misconduct from 2003 for attempting to, unsurprisingly, develop a personal relationship with a patient. Eventually, all of Mel's improprieties were leaked after a 2021 hearing with the Michigan Board of Psychologists. It essentially illustrated a career-long pattern of crossing the line and manipulating patients from the early 80s and onwards. It may never be known what treatment looked like for high-profile clients like Bedford and Rodman, what lines may have been crossed, or the impact he had on them. Questions still hang in the air around why Hoberman was fixing the clock. Was it a case of hometown favoritism, or something far more nefarious? Who was winning all of those bets? Did Edwards and Thomas knowingly throw those games in '89? And who was the anonymous Piston that spoke to journalists about the fix? Maybe we'll never know. As this sordid chapter of Detroit basketball wrapped up, the whispers of point shaving, scorekeeping tricks, and the influence of gambling on the game seemed to slow for a moment. Maybe, for once, the game was safe again. All of this is a thing of the past. Wait a second.
Toronto Raptors center Jonte Porter has been banned for life